Chapter 8. From Marginalism to Modern Sociology. Economic theory, social economics, and the tasks of sociology. The quote, marginalist revolution, unquote, emerged in response to the problem of conceptualizing both the possibilities and limits of social reform, so overcoming the apparently unbridgeable gap between the dogmatic liberalism of political economy and the opportunistic reformism of sociology and historicism. Many of the marginalists came to economics specifically in order to give a rigorous foundation to sociology and to historicism. Menger and Walras saw their work as bringing rigor to the tradition of, quote, vulgar economy, associated with the German historical school. Jevons formulated his economics within a Spencerian framework, while Wieser was also inspired to turn to economics by reading Spencer. While Walras formulated his economics within a reformist framework that owed much to Comte and Saint-Simon, while Wicksteed came to marginalism from Comte and Henry George. Alfred Marshall had studied moral sciences and saw economics as a continuation of those studies. Thus, marginalism developed not in opposition to the sociological and historical traditions, but as an essential complement to them, providing the rigorous foundation that they had hitherto lacked. The complementarity of marginalism on the one hand, and sociology and history on the other, was not immediately apparent, not least because some of the pioneers of marginalist revolution used the new theory to assert the virtues of a regime of laissez-faire against the claims of social reform. Thus, Jevons was engaged in constant polemic with sociologists and social reformers, while Menger was involved in an acrimonious methodological debate with Gustav Schmoller, the Methodenstreit. While the debate between economics on the one hand and sociology and history on the other remained a debate between economic liberalism and social reform, the two schools of thought found themselves implacably opposed to one another, each asserting its own exclusive claims. By the 1890s, it was clear that social and political reform in Britain, Austria, and Germany had succeeded in establishing a constitutional and political framework within which the working class could be persuaded, at least for the moment, to pursue its political aims peacefully and constitutionally. The reformers were triumphantly vindicated. However, once the success of reform was generally accepted, the terrain of debate shifted. The most pressing issue was not that of whether or not to introduce social reform, legalize trade unionism, and admit sections of the working class to the suffrage. The issue was now how far should such reform go. While liberals had to concede exceptions to the laissez-faire principle, particularly in the determination of the terms and conditions of labor, social reformers had to concede that the discipline of the market must continue to have a major role to play if the advance of the working class was not to compromise the continued existence of capitalism. It was at this point that it became essential to work out a more rigorous relationship between economics and sociology, and to establish a stable intellectual division of labor between complementary disciplines. The development of modern sociology involved both recognizing and setting limits to the claims of the economists as the basis on which to reinterpret established sociological traditions. The first important stage in this process was the development of, quote, social economics, unquote, which introduced the concept of, quote, economic power, end quote. The theoretical importance of this was that it reintroduced the concept of class that had been expelled from the pure theory of the capitalist economy by the marginalist revolution. However, the concept of class employed here is quite different from the concept developed by classical political economy and by Marx. In the latter theories, the social relations of capitalist society were necessarily class relations. The concept of social class defining the objective basis on which the individual participates in society, by defining the point of insertion of the individual into the social relations of production, distribution, and exchange. The marginalist revolution abolished the classical theory of distribution, and so expelled the concept of class from economics in favor of a purely individualistic theory of economic relations. The concept of class now appears at a lower level of abstraction, becoming a purely sociological concept in the sense that it now characterizes particular social groups that arise out of the free association of individuals on the basis of their perception of common economic interest. It is now economic interest that underlies the formation of classes, not the existence of classes that underlies the conflict of interest. Common economic interest can in principle be found in any situation in which the fate of a number of individuals depends on the terms of the purchase or sale of a given commodity. So there is no reason to limit the application of the concept to capitalists and workers as a whole. Quote, from this standpoint, physicians and officials, e.g., would also constitute two classes, for they belong to two distinct social groups, the members of each of these groups receiving their revenue from one and the same source. The same would also be true of the infinite fragmentation of interest and rank into which the division of social labor splits laborers as well as capitalists and landlords, the latter, e.g., into owners of vineyards, farm owners, owners of forests, mine owners, and owners of fisheries. End quote. Capital, Volume 3. Within the framework of marginalism, classes arise not on the basis of the relations of production as in Marxism, nor on the basis of the relations of distribution as in classical political economy, but on the basis of exchange relations. A class arises out of the appreciation of a common interest in the purchase or sale of a particular commodity, as a means of seeking to improve the terms on which that commodity is traded to the advantage of that class. A class conflict is the socially organized manifestation of the conflict of interest that is inherent in any exchange, as each party seeks to achieve exchange on the most favorable terms. The ideological and political implications of this displacement of the concept of class should be clear. The immediate implication is that class conflict is no longer fundamental to capitalist economic relations, but rather is a superficial disturbance that arises as special interests seek to subvert the competitive process to their own ends. For the economic liberal, the formation of classes and the consequent class conflict is entirely illegitimate, and the state is required to legislate to prevent the formation of agreements and restraint of trade by means of which classes seek to pursue their ends. For the reformist, the imbalance of resources between labor and capital requires some correction, which may justify the association of workers in properly regulated trade unions in order to achieve a countervailing power. The Fabians went further still in believing that it was impossible to prevent the abuse of economic power so long as capital remained in private hands. This did not lead the Fabians to reject marginalist economics. For the Fabians, Wicksteed's marginalism showed the possibility of a rational economic system and countered the Marxist theory of class exploitation. Thus, the Fabians proposed that the state should peacefully assume the functions of capital in order to achieve in reality the marginalist ideal. The Fabian state capitalism did not involve any fundamental transformation of social and political relations, but simply a transfer of given functions from capitalists to managers and administrators. In France and Germany, considerable importance was attached to the preservation of the middle class, and particularly of small rural producers, in the face of capitalist competition by the provision of credit, the formation of rural cooperatives, the reform of tenancy laws, and by protection legislation. In all these cases, however, the theoretical framework is the same. Social class and class conflict only arise to the extent that the operation of the market is imperfect. They are not expressions of the fundamental character of capitalist economic relations, but merely imperfections hindering its smooth operation. The theory of the social economy. The study of the social framework of capitalist economic activity first emerged as the complementary discipline of social economics. In many cases, social economics was essentially an empirical discipline investigating the distribution of income, conditions of employment and unemployment, provision for the poor and the sick, etc. However, attempts were also made to develop a more systematic approach to the social framework of capitalism. Developing social economics as a theoretical and not simply as an empirical discipline, on the basis of the marginalist analysis of the economy. In Britain, the Fabians played a pioneering role in this respect, and Piaget led the development of social economics as a rigorous branch of the discipline. Elsewhere, one of the most important contributions was that of Wieser, most notably in his Social Economics, written or published in 1914, which is significant both for the clarity of its exposition and the influence it had on Max Weber. Wieser originally took up the study of economics inspired by a reading of Herbert Spencer, and was attracted by Menger's attempt to get beyond the conception of society as an organism by tracing the origins of organic institutions and individual behavior. Although a follower of Menger, Wieser originally took up the study of economics inspired by a reading of Herbert Spencer, and was attracted by Menger's attempt to get beyond the conception of society as an organism by tracing the origins of organic institutions in individual behavior. Although a follower of Menger, Wieser recognized more clearly than did Menger the need for a reform and for an adequate understanding of the social context of the capitalist economy. This is the theme of his books, Law and Power, published in 1910, and The Law of Power, published in 1926, but was developed most systematically in social economics, which brought clearly into view the connection between Wieser's economics and his program for sociology. Social Economics was published in 1914 as part of the Grundrisse der Sozialökonomik, edited by Max Weber, a series of which Weber's Economy and Society and an early version of Schumpeter's History of Economic Analysis appeared as subsequent volumes. Weber is reported to have made it a condition of his participation in the project that Wieser should write the economic theory section of the series, but the volume that resulted is more than an exercise in pure economic theory. In the preface to the second edition, 1924, Wieser made explicit the concerns that motivated him in writing the book. The problem that he confronted was that the capitalist economy was based on the pursuit of personal interests. But this made it possible for individuals to use their power to override the general interest. The, quote, highest task of theory was to show, quote, in what relations this consciousness and power were in harmony and in opposition to the creation of the social state and world economy, end quote, and so to what extent it was necessary to curb such power. Theory would thus define the tasks of, quote, enlightened statesmanship. In particular, theory would point the way to needed reforms, end quote, and would serve the state in showing, quote, those most general elements of management and value which have always existed and will always exist, end quote. The context of this need for reform was the rise of the proletariat. Quote, almost everywhere in Europe, the proletariat has come forward with such strength that it must be considered and a counter-reform of the economic order proposed, end quote. Wieser. This is something that classical economics could not accommodate, because it was formulated at such a high level of abstraction that it neglected questions of power, conflict, and economic evil. Quote, "The classical theory does not go to the root of the economic interconnection sufficiently to explain the meaning of a developed national economy. It does not enable us to refute the socialistic criticism of the prevailing order. It has, on the contrary, supplied the most important arguments of that criticism. The classical theory of freedom, above all, results in a vindication of capitalistic domination." End quote. Wieser starts with the theory of the simple economy, which abstracts from all social institutions, providing a general explanation that is, quote, "not dependent on the form of exchange," end quote. Essentially, it is the model of an ideal organic society, directed by a single individual who adopts a, quote, "rationalistically utilitarian point of view," end quote. This abstraction made it possible to theorize a society in which individual and social rationality were identical, in which the good of one was the good of all. The elements of this economy were individuals with given needs and preferences, producing scarce goods with scarce land, labor, and means of production. The result attained was the familiar marginalist equalization of relative marginal utilities. In the theory of the social economy, exchange and private property were introduced. The results derived from the theory of the simple economy still held for the exchange economy, which was simply a sum of simple economies, so long as we abstract from the abuse of power. Quote, "Whenever we disregard the stress of economic power, we shall find that the utility value of the simple economy is precisely the same economic value which functions in the transaction of economic exchange." Transactions of economic exchange, end quote. However, such an abstraction is no longer legitimate. Quote, An economic theory that should suffice for our times is inconceivable without a social theory that is consistent with the fact of power," end quote. Wieser. Social power is the basis on which social classes are formed. However, social superiority is not based entirely on property, but on any factor that bestows a favorable market position on its holder. Thus, such factors as education also play a role, and it is important to take account of horizontal divisions based on the division of labor. Thus, power in our society is multidimensional, based on the possession of a favorable market situation. In the social economy, we are no longer dealing with the abstract individual of utilitarianism. In economic conduct, argued Wieser, the individual was determined by social forces. Quote, "Needs, impulses, and egoism itself are dominated by social powers," end quote. Hence, economic rationality was embodied in the norms of society. In accepting the norms of society, the, quote, "socially educated individual," end quote, transformed her egoism into, quote, "social egoism," end quote. Thus, the implications of the existence of social stratification and of differences of power were moderated as normative restraints limited the abuse of power and position. The normative regulation of egoism meant that, if we abstract from crises and panics and assume a voluntary subordination to law and morality, the exchange economy still has the result that, quote, "production values are unified and concentrated, and their apportionment to the individual branches of production take place as by a social plan." The spirit of a social economy is complied with, The spirit of a social economy is complied with, although there is not a unitary social management, end quote. Thus, quote, where the general conditions are considered socially satisfactory and morally and legally correct, the general price is found also to be just, the just or equitable price, end quote. Wieser was not so naive as to believe that these ideal conditions pertain in our society. For Wieser argued that the polarization of wealth and power is too great for normative restraint to be effective. Overcompetition of the poor in labor markets forces down wages, while overcompetition of the rich in product markets leads to overproduction. So to have a well-ordered market, controls on competition are required. Moreover, victory in competition goes not to the most efficient, but to the largest capitals, which are best able to survive, quote, revolutions of trade, end quote. The effect is the increasing polarization of society, as the industrial middle classes are displaced into the proletariat, and the proletariat is deskilled. The rich are satiated, the poor overworked and underpaid, morally and culturally debased. Under the, quote, capitalistic relations of employment, end quote, workers lack the will to work. Thus the, quote, contrast of capitalistic affluence and proletarian misery become too glaring, and if this polarization becomes extreme, quote, it would then be obvious that the social economy had wholly lost its significance, end quote. Wieser. This description of the tendencies of developed capitalism is hardly that of an apologist for the existing order. Indeed, the symptoms that Wieser identified are precisely those contradictions that Marx saw as inherent in the capitalist system. Extremes of wealth and poverty, class polarization, overwork and unemployment, satiation and cultural debilitation, centralization of capital and overproduction. However, Wieser was insistent that these deficiencies are not inherent in capitalism, nor do these deficiencies counterbalance the positive features of the capitalist system. The capitalist economy alone is able to allocate resources efficiently, so that production is maximized. Thus, quote, it may well be that a system of rules, which distributes very unequally the enormous gains to which it is instrumental, is after all more beneficial to the mass of the citizens than another, doling out its much smaller proceeds according to the principles of right and reason, in quotation marks, end quote. A quote inside a quote. The task was not to abolish capitalism, but to perfect capitalism by eliminating the abuse of power. Two different directions of reform opened up from this analysis. One was to seek to curb the abuse of power by removing the restrictions to competition that arose from monopolization, state intervention, and ignorance. It was in this direction that most of the second-generation Austrians, including von Mises and Hayek, developed the marginalist analysis. Wieser, however, was more realistic, realizing that capitalism's defects were the result of competition in an unequal society, not the results of curbing competition. Wieser, therefore, favored reformist solutions that extended the legal and administrative regulation of economic relations through the encouragement of trade unionism, protective legislation, factory legislation, compulsory insurance, housing policy, control of speculation, land reform, and state and municipal enterprises. There is no reason to believe that these measures could not resolve the problem of power within the exchange economy, for there was no evidence that exploitation is inherent in exchange. The urgent need was to, quote, lay down for modern policy full theoretical foundations, end quote, that would make it possible to delimit the, quote, boundaries and instruments permitted to state policy, end quote. Wieser recognized the defects of actually existing capitalism, which Wieser saw as the result of the inevitable emergence of inequalities of wealth and power, and the associated breakdown of normative regulation to which capitalism gave rise. But at the same time, Wieser insisted that such defects were not inherent in capitalism, but only in the abuse of inequalities of wealth and power, which could be checked by a rationally informed state policy. Thus, the, quote, substantive irrationality, end quote, of capitalism could be separated from capitalism's, quote, formal rationality, end quote, a proper program of reform checking the former in order to realize the latter, checking the substantive irrationality and realizing the formal rationality. Social economics went beyond the abstractions of the pure theory of the exchange economy by introducing the concept of economic power. However, this concept alone, important as it is, was hardly a sufficient foundation on which to build a sociology. Social economics continued to be a branch of economics, rather than of sociology, in resting on the assumption that social action can be explained as an expression of the rational self-interest of the individual, and in reducing social power to economic power. This left two gaps to be fulfilled by a renewed sociology. On the one hand, a, quote, economic sociology, end quote, was required that could explain the normative regulation of rational economic action by exploring the formation of Wieser's, quote, social egoism, Comte's, quote, social love, or Smith's, quote, moral sentiments. Such an economic sociology would also have to explore the character and determinants of economic power in the formation of social classes. Such an economic sociology would also have to explore the character and determinants of economic power in the formation of social classes. On the other hand, social economics provided no means of understanding the consequences of social action not oriented solely to economic ends, or of social power that rested on other than purely economic foundations. In particular, social economics had no means of dealing with the state and political power. The state was called on to implement a program of social reform and to regulate the class struggle as though it were a neutral, benevolent institution standing above society. However, the state was itself an object of class struggle and of intense political debate as to the state's proper role. Socialists on the one side threatened either to destroy the state or use the state to abolish capitalism. On the other side, monopoly capital threatened to subordinate the state to monopoly capital's own ends, backing its resistance to the demands of the working class. Furthering its advance at the expense of smaller capitalists and petty producers. Pursuing monopoly capital's imperialist aims in the colonies and threatening to drag the nation into inter-imperialist wars, social economics helped to clear the space for modern sociology, but that space had still to be filled. Max Weber and the German Historical School. It was Max Weber, more than anyone else, who defined the relationship between marginalist economics on the one hand, and historical and sociological investigation on the other. It is in this sense that we can see Weber as the true founder of modern sociology, in that it was Weber who defined their respective fields for both economics and sociology, establishing the limits of economics and defining the space to be filled by sociology. Max Weber was born in 1864 and was trained in law and economics within the tradition of the German historical school. Weber was a member of the Verein für Sozialpolitik from 1888 until his death in 1920. The older generation of Verein, led by Schmoller and Adolf Wagner, favored the Bismarckian approach to social reform, believing that class conflict was a pathological phenomenon that could be suppressed by the state, while the condition of the working class could be ameliorated within a paternalistic and bureaucratic framework of social reform and political regulation of the economy. Such an approach proved to have severe limitations. While bureaucratic regulations stifled economic initiative and so restricted the expansion of the German economy, the Social Democratic Party, though illegal, was advancing from strength to strength. Juncker, domination of the Prussian state, meant that the expansion of capitalist agriculture and the consequent proletarianization of the rural population was advancing with little restraint, with potentially disastrous political consequences. While the older generation of the Verein placed their faith in the neutrality and rationality of the Prussian bureaucracy, the younger generation, of which Weber was a part, along with Sombart, Tönnies, and Brentano, saw the bureaucracy as self-interested and as morally and politically stultifying, and so looked for more liberal solutions. The younger generation believed that the rise of social democracy could not be attributed to exceptional causes, but had to be explained on the basis of the existence of a fundamental opposition of class interests within capitalist society, and of the tendency for classes to organize in order to further their interests. Marxism had an obvious theoretical appeal to some of the younger generation, although they rejected Marx's political conclusions on the basis of neo-Kantian arguments about the separation of fact and value. Marx was right to draw attention to class conflict as a central feature of capitalist society, but Marx's theory could not dictate how the conflict ought to be resolved. The younger generation rejected socialist solutions, which they saw as suffering from the same defects of bureaucratism, as did conservatism, and sought instead to establish the political conditions under which class struggle could be regulated and subordinated to national, ethical, and political goals. They favored the liberalization of state policy, freeing capital from the more restrictive burdens imposed on it, while looking to properly regulate trade unionism and to some extent constitutional reform as the means of assimilating the working class. Thus, the recognition of the existence of class struggle did not compromise their adherence to a fundamentally liberal theory of capitalist society, or to liberal solutions to the social problems to which capitalism gave rise. In their concern for social reform as the alternative to revolution, the younger generation of the Verein found much in common with the revisionist wing of social democracy, which sought to divorce the reformist activity of social democracy from its revolutionary political rhetoric, a position that looked to Fabianism and to marginalist economics for their theoretical support. For the younger generation of the Verein, trade unionism and cooperation had lost their menacing appearance and could offer a basis on which the working class could acquire the most petite bourgeois of moral qualities, and through which the working class could be incorporated into a national ethical and political framework. The younger generation therefore sought to reconcile the existence of economic conflict between the classes with the ethical and political consensus on which a liberal state had to rest. The younger generation therefore sought to reconcile the existence of economic conflict between the classes with the ethical and political consensus on which a liberal state had to rest. Political consensus on which a liberal state had to rest. It was clear that neither the free market nor corporatist or socialist bureaucracy could provide a satisfactory framework within which conflicts of economic interest could be resolved. Thus, the younger generation of the Pharaon was preoccupied with the complementary issues of the nature and the limits of the free market on the one hand, and the nature and limits of the liberal state on the other, their solutions ultimately resting on profoundly moralistic foundations. This generation saw in Max Weber their most outstanding spokesman. Weber's early work was very much within the mainstream of the historical school. His first published works were two theses on medieval trading companies and on the agrarian history of Rome. Although Weber was hailed by the great classical scholar Theodor Mommsen as his true heir, he came to believe that contemporary ethical and political problems could not really be solved by drawing lessons from the fate of Rome. So he turned his attention to the direct study of contemporary society and began to look in different directions for his comparative material. The most interesting of Weber's early works, at least for the light it throws on his own orientation, is the research that he conducted under the aegis of the Verein on, quote, the conditions of rural labor in Germany beyond the Elbe, end quote, published in 1892. This research was ostensibly a study of the impact of capitalist development on the rural social structure of Eastern Prussia and showed how the expansion of capitalist agriculture had eroded patriarchal relations in agriculture, reducing the labor force to a rural proletariat. Under the impact of such a development, the Prussian rural workers were emigrating to the towns and were being replaced by Polish peasants who were prepared to work for lower wages and under conditions of abject subordination to their employers. Such a development was hardly unique to Prussia, nor was Weber by any means the first to observe it. The importance of Weber's contribution lies not in its substantive content, so much as in the lessons Weber drew from his study, which indeed motivated it in the first place. For Weber, the development of capitalism in rural Prussia was undoubtedly progressive if evaluated in purely economic terms. However, economic criteria alone were not sufficient to evaluate social developments or policies to modify such developments. Thus, the development of capitalism was increasing the productivity of agriculture, fostering the accumulation of capital and enriching the rural Junkers, but it was doing so at the expense of the ethical and political foundations of the nation. The sturdy, independent Prussian peasant, whose moral qualities had contributed in no small way to the virtues of the Prussian state, was being eliminated, replaced by a dependent workforce of much inferior cultural quality, which was prepared to work under the most exploitative and degrading conditions. Moreover, this new workforce was not only culturally inferior, it was also culturally alien, and so a potential fifth column in the event of political or military threats from the East. Finally, the development of capitalism in undermining patriarchal relations in agriculture was establishing the conditions for the growth of class conflict in the countryside. The development of capitalism in rural Prussia was therefore strengthening the Junkers economically, while turning the Junkers into a section of the capitalist class, but it was eroding the ethical and political foundations of national security in the most sensitive eastern border regions. The conclusion was that, on the one hand, the degradation of the Junkers to a section of the capitalist class meant that their political rule was now that of a self-interested clique. The consequences of which would prove catastrophic to the national interest. On the other hand, Weber found it difficult to see in the bourgeoisie a class that could provide the political leadership for a truly national policy, putting the political interest of the, quote, power state above sectional interests. Such leadership would have to regulate capitalist development in accordance with national political and ethical ideals, and in particular, to regulate the capitalization of agriculture by closing the eastern border and by resettling Germans as protected agrarian petty producers. Weber's study of the Prussian peasant closely links Weber's own political and theoretical concerns with the tradition of the Verein. Weber's study not only anticipates his own later work, it also embodies all the central themes of the political and academic orientations of the Verein. The subordination of academic research to pressing political concerns, the insistence on the primacy of ethical and political criteria in the evaluation of economic policy, the emphasis on the priority of national over sectional interests, the focus on the state as the embodiment of the nation, the nostalgic evocation of patriarchal relations, the insistence on the positive ethical virtues of petite bourgeois morality, and the political necessity of sustaining a strong and independent petite bourgeoisie as the basis of a powerful nation-state. Despite this, Weber was never entirely at home in the Verein, although his differences did not really emerge into the open until after his recovery from a serious nervous breakdown at the turn of the century. Weber's critique of the Verein, and more generally of the German historical school, was made explicit in a series of methodological essays largely written as Weber emerged from his breakdown. Weber's arguments in these essays are often close to those of Menger, which precipitated the Methodenstreit. However, Weber did not simply abandon the methodological prescriptions of the historical school for the scientific methodology of marginalist economics. On the one hand, the positions Weber developed in his methodological writings were at least to some extent already implicit in his historical works. On the other hand, Weber achieved what many have seen as a methodological synthesis of the positions of the contending parties. However, if there is a synthesis, its basis is definitely on the Austrian side of the divide. Thus, on the two essential and fundamental points of difference, Weber aligns himself unequivocally with Menger. On the one hand, Weber endorsed Menger's insistence that economics is not an ethical science, in the sense that it cannot give rise to ethical prescriptions, but must be conducted on a strictly objective basis. On the other hand, he endorsed Menger's insistence that historical interpretation presupposes that the historical sciences have an analytic core in the form of a pure theory of typical relationships. Weber had never been happy about the subordination of the work of the Verein to particular political ends. While Weber endorsed the emphasis of the Verein on conducting research that was, quote, value relevant, end quote, that would inform contemporary ethical and political debate, Weber insisted that the research itself had to be conducted with a scrupulous regard for objectivity, and that the results of the research could not impose particular ethical or political conclusions. Research could provide only the facts that could inform debate. To reach ethical conclusions, it was necessary to judge those facts in accordance with chosen ethical criteria. The argument was extremely disingenuous, however, well-intentioned, for while the facts might never be able to impose a particular judgment, they could certainly be formulated in such a way as to leave little room for serious choice, an excellent example of which would be Weber's own study of the Prussian peasantry. Problems of methodology. Menger and Weber. The most important methodological contribution made by Max Weber concerns the role of theory within the social sciences, and here again, Weber's position is much closer to that of Menger than it is to the historical school. To bring out the relationship, I shall present Weber's views in relation to those of Menger. Menger wrote his Problems of Economics and Sociology as a counterblast to the historical school's rejection of the abstraction of classical political economy. Menger agreed that classical political economy was too abstract to provide a sufficient, quote, basis for the practical sciences of national economy, and thus also of practice in this field, end quote. However, the failings of classical political economy should not lead to a condemnation of all abstraction in the name of a purely pragmatic approach to the facts. Such pragmatism could for Menger lead only to socialism, as the historical school's enthusiasm for reform sponsored by the state was untempered by any adequate theory of the limits of reform or of the nature of the state. Without such a theory, state intervention is proposed as the solution to every social problem until the whole of society is engulfed by the state. One second. Menger argues that the proper response to the failures of classical political economy is not to reject theory, but to construct a more adequate theory on the basis of a clear recognition of the abstract character of such a theory and of the distance that separates theoretical abstraction from concrete historical understanding. Thus, Menger distinguishes the theoretical form from the historical and practical sciences. Historical understanding is related to an individual process of development, whereas theoretical understanding subsumes the event under a law of succession or of coexistence that is derived from a theory, in this case of the economy. The two are distinct because the theory is necessarily abstract, concerned with, quote, the general nature and the general connection of economic phenomena, end quote. Menger. The distinction between the historical and the theoretical orientations for Menger corresponds to a distinction between the methods of the inductive elaboration of empirical laws and deductive elaboration of theoretical statements. The theoretical orientation establishes exact laws that, quote, simply bear within themselves the guarantee of absoluteness, end quote, being based on the deductive elaboration of the, quote, simplest elements of everything real, elements that must be thought of as strictly typical just because they are the simplest, end quote. Menger. The exact theory of economics, therefore, comprises what would nowadays be called a hypothetico-deductive elaboration of a, quote, analytically or abstractly conceived economic world, end quote. The exact laws formulated in this theory are to be distinguished from empirical laws, and they do not depend on empirical laws for their confirmation. Indeed, they cannot be confirmed empirically because they are abstract idealizations that rest on certain presuppositions that may never apply in reality. The typical forms on which theory is based can never give rise to a full understanding of reality, since the types represent an idealization of reality. They're, quote, phenomenal forms, end quote, not necessarily corresponding to the infinite complexity of the corresponding, quote, empirical forms, end quote. Thus, in reality, different examples of the same phenomenon are never identical, so that a historical orientation that seeks to grasp the individual process of development can never rest content with theoretical knowledge of ideal typical relations, but must seek the empirical relations between real types. For this reason, Menger strongly opposed the mathematical formulation of economic theories, since this gave to economic relations an exactness that they never enjoyed in reality. Thus Menger, like Marx, and for similar reasons, proliferated concrete arithmetical examples rather than attempting to achieve a spurious generality through algebraic formulation. On the other hand, Menger argued that the historical orientation could never get beyond empirical relations, and so could never achieve more than the knowledge of contingent empirical laws. Since theoretical argument is based on abstraction from and idealization of reality, it always seeks to understand reality from a particular point of view. Thus, economics seeks to understand reality from the point of view of the precautionary activities of humans directed towards covering their material needs, end quote. Theoretically, the economic aspect of phenomenon can be studied in abstraction from all other aspects, although historically the economy can only be understood in connection with the total life of a nation. Thus, historical understanding rests on the contributions of the totality of the social sciences, quote, no one of which teaches us to understand full empirical reality, end quote. Menger. The abstraction of economics is legitimate and fruitful not because the economist believes the, quote, dogma of self-interest, end quote, Schmoller, but because economic provision in accordance with the individual's own well-being is amongst the most common and most important human efforts and impulses. Theoretical knowledge is the necessary foundation of the historical orientation. Although the historical orientation aspires to knowledge of the single sequence of events, the basis of such knowledge can only be the typical forms elaborated in theory. Although the simple types and the laws by which complicated phenomena are built up from the simplest forms are abstract and universal, historical investigation constantly reveals new empirical variants of these types and more complex elaborations of the simple types. Thus, the absolute character of theoretical understanding by no means makes it inapplicable to historical understanding. However, these types and typical relations are not derived from the study of history, nor do they develop historically, but are based upon, quote, experience in general, end quote, Menger. That is to say, on the universality of the economic problem of the rational provision for material needs. Weber's methodological position was in many respects very similar to that of Menger, although the similarity does not necessarily reflect a direct influence, but could as well express a common substantive ambition within a common neo-Kantian framework. Weber's specific methodological departures from Menger very closely parallel his substantive critique of Menger's approach to economic theory. Weber, like Menger, although for somewhat different reasons, was dissatisfied with the pragmatism of the historical school both politically, in its readiness to see the solution of all social problems in the benign intervention of the state, and methodologically in its subordination of theoretical investigation to political concerns, that led to a purely pragmatic empiricism. Thus Weber, like Menger, sought to define and defend a specific role for theory within the social sciences, without falling back on the absolutism of classical political economy, which claimed an exclusive legitimacy for theoretical understanding. Theory for Weber, as for Menger, was necessarily abstract, concerned with typical relationships and the construction and elaboration of ideal types, to which no reality would exactly correspond. Historical understanding was only possible on the basis of such typical constructs. but cannot be exhausted by such typifications. Finally, Weber, like Menger, argued that the recognition of the legal, political, and ethical dimensions of social life did not invalidate the scientific autonomy of economics, since any science sought only a partial understanding of reality. A full historical understanding requiring the participation of all the social sciences. Where Weber departed from Menger most fundamentally was in his characterization of the typical foundations of social theory. For Menger, economics is concerned with the universal economic problem of the rational provision for human material needs. The types on which economic theory is based are therefore elaborations of the principles of rational choice, and for the Austrian school, economics is a branch of praxeology, the general theory of rational choice. Praxeology was originally seen as a branch of a universal psychology, so that the laws of economics had a psychological foundation and a universal validity. For Menger, economic theory elaborated on the general categories of human experience. Economics theory's universal and absolute character being verified by the introspective examination of the, quote, practical consciousness of economic relations, end quote. Wieser. Its certainty expressed the certainty of intuitive knowledge. The universality of economic theory rested ultimately on the supposed universality of economic rationality. In this respect, the institutions of capitalist society are the products of the progressive realization of this rationality. In this respect, the institutions of capitalist society are the products of the progressive realization of this rationality. For Weber, as for his colleagues in the historical school, economic rationality is not such a self-evident universal truth. On the one hand, the single-minded pursuit of economic goals could be at the expense of ethical and political goals which were valued more highly. Thus, for example, the Junkers' pursuit of profit on their eastern estates was at the expense of the political security of the nation. On the other hand, the rational adaptation of means to ends is only one possible value orientation that is characteristic of a particular society, but that does not have universal validity. Thus, economic theory is not based on an ideal type that expresses the certain intuitive knowledge of a naturalistic psychological orientation. It is based on an ideal type that expresses a particular value orientation that has its own historical origin. The institution of capitalist society cannot be seen as the products. The institutions of capitalist society cannot be seen as the products of a universal rationality, for the historical origins of this form of rationality have themselves to be explained. Previous forms of society are not to be dismissed as less developed versions of our own, for they are based on different value orientations to be captured by distinct ideal types. Quote, economic laws are schemata of rational action. Economic laws cannot be deduced from a psychological analysis of the individual, end quote. Weber. Menger's belief in the realistic psychological foundations of economic theory led him to contradict the distinction on which he had initially insisted. Menger's belief in the realistic psychological foundations of economic theory led him to contradict the distinction on which he had initially insisted between historical and theoretical knowledge, and going on to claim, quote, empirical validity in the sense of the deducibility of reality from, quote, laws for the propositions of abstract theory, end quote. For Weber, by contrast, the ideal type had no reality of its own. The ideal type was strictly a utopia, a heuristic device, facilitating the formulation of hypotheses and the exploration of historical connections. For Weber, therefore, the validity of the ideal type could not transcend those historical circumstances in which its reality as a meaning principle could be attested, and those historical examples to whose understanding it contributes. Thus, Weber insisted that theory could never give rise to a distinctive form of knowledge. Theory was merely a tool that could be used in achieving the only valid form of knowledge, knowledge of specific historical events. Weber's ideal type was a hypothetical construct that was based not on the introspective understanding of the universal principles of experience, but on the historical understanding of the typical complexes of values that motivate actors in different societies at different times. The elaboration of such ideal types depended for Weber, by contrast to Menger, on detailed and extensive comparative and historical investigation that can assist the analyst in the construction of the complexes that make up the ideal type. Thus, Weber retained the essential features of Menger's methodology, while reversing the relation of priority between historical and theoretical understanding, with the ideal types of theory depending on their elaboration, with ideal types of theory depending for their elaboration and for their validity on historical research. Weber's emphasis on the character of ideal types as value constructs reflected the concern that Weber inherited from the historical school to emphasize the extent to which capitalist rationality was itself a particular ethical ideal, contrasting sharply with the ethical ideals of a feudal paternalism. Capitalist rationality had particular ethical implications, for example, in opening up economic conflicts that had previously been subordinated to the sense of community through the subordination of self-interest to duty. However, this does not mean that Weber has to be seen in this respect as a follower of Schmoller as against Menger, for even here, at the essential point, Weber sided with Menger. For the German historical school, the ethical orientation of political economy implied not only that capitalist rationality was an ethical ideal. Much more importantly, the ethical orientation of political economy implied, firstly, that economic ideals could not be considered in abstraction from ethical and political ideals, so that economics could not be abstracted from an all-embracing history. From this point of view, capitalist rationality could be criticized from the standpoint of higher ethical ideals, for example, the ideals of community or of self-sufficiency and independence that capitalism undermined. This position Weber rejected as clearly and emphatically as did Menger. Quote, the belief that it is the task of scientific work to cure the, quote, one-sidedness of the economic approach by broadening it into a general social science suffers primarily from the weakness that the, quote, social criterion, i.e. the relationships among persons, acquires the specificity necessary for the delimitation of scientific problems only when it is accompanied by some substantive predicate. End quote. There cannot be a, quote, general science of the social, for the, quote, generality of the term, quote, social, quote, rests on nothing but its ambiguity. It provides, when taken in its, quote, general meaning, no specific point of view from which the significance of given elements of culture can be analyzed, end quote. Weber. Thus Weber was unhappy about the use of the term, quote, sociology that had strong connotations of just such a spurious generality. The second implication of the ethical orientation for the historical school was that the rejection of the, quote, dogma of self-interest was a rejection not only of a social theory based on egoism, but more fundamentally of a social theory based on the individual, in favor of an approach that gave full weight to the importance of historically specific institutions, such as the state, the community, and the family, as the transcendent source of ethical ideals and object of ethical obligations. Menger recognized the necessary role that such institutions played in historical understanding. Thus, history, quote, cannot solve its problems by investigating and cataloging the vast quantity of singular phenomena of human life. Rather, it can do justice to it only by bringing together what is individual in the real world from the point of view of collective phenomenon, and making us aware of the nature and the connection of the above phenomenon to those large collective phenomena which we call nation, state, society. The fates of single individuals, their acts per se, are not the subject matter of history, but only the fates and acts of nations, end quote, Menger. However, Menger was at his most insistent in rejecting the organicism of the German historical school that it led to postulate such collective phenomenon as sui generis realities. At the level of historical understanding, an organic perspective may be necessary, and it may even serve to orient theoretical research. But the organic perspective must always be recognized as provisional. The most fundamental task of theoretical understanding was precisely to undermine the dangerous illusions to which organicism gave rise by discovering the individual foundations of collective institutions. Once collective institutions were attributed their own rationality, there was no limit to their elaboration, and state socialism was the inevitable result. Thus it was politically, as well as theoretically essential, that rationality should be attributed to such institutions only to the extent that those institutions could be shown to express, in their functioning, the rationality of individual actors. Theory was essential to defend the ideals of liberalism against collectivist overenthusiasm. Thus Menger posed, quote, perhaps the most noteworthy problem of the social sciences: how it can be that institutions which serve the common welfare and are extremely significant for the common welfare's development come into being without a common will directed towards establishing them, end quote, Menger. Menger answered by arguing that where such institutions did not have a pragmatic origin and a common intention, they could arise only as unintended results of individual action. The fundamental task of the social sciences in this respect, therefore, was to trace the origin of organic social phenomenon as the unintended consequences of the individual actions that gave rise to them in order to evaluate them in relation to individual rationality. Menger accordingly turned to do just this for such institutions as money, prices, exchange, private property, and the division of labor, which were explained as the results of the collective emulation of individual initiatives, and so as the social crystallization of individual rationality. In his liberalism, Weber again aligned himself firmly with Menger against the organicism of the historical school. Although Weber followed the historical school in emphasizing the importance of ethical ideals, Weber insisted that those ideals were not transcendent, but could only be individual ideals that were chosen, not imposed. Thus, although it is true that Weber reconciled, however uneasily, the quote, positivism of marginalism with the quote, idealism of the historical school, the reconciliation was on the basis of the marginalist conception of society and the marginalist conception of the social sciences. Weber differed from Menger in two essential respects. On the one hand, Weber rejected Menger's belief in the universality of economic rationality, considering the latter to represent a specific ethical ideal and not a psychological universal. On the other hand, Weber rejected Menger's overenthusiastic confidence in the virtues of a regime of economic liberalism. It was on the basis of these two essential differences that Weber built his systematic sociology. For this sociology was built as a complement to, not a substitute for, the marginalist conception of the economy. The problem of rationality. The methodological convergence between Weber's sociology and marginalist economics is only a symptom of their substantive affinity. The two shared a common liberal individualist starting point. Weber fully accepted that marginalism provided an adequate account of economic action in a capitalist society, and, at least at the economic level, of the origins of the specifically economic institutions of capitalist society. Thus Weber accepted Menger's account of the rational origins of money and of market exchange, and the marginalist conception of the economic institutions of capitalism as embodiments of economic rationality, as technical means adapted to the achievement of economic ends, and so as, quote, facts, end quote, at least in relation to the ethical ideal of economic rationality. What Weber rejected about marginalist economics was its, quote, naturalism, and its implicit subordination of ethical and political ends to the single ideal of economic rationality. For Weber, by contrast, economic rationality could only be a subordinate ethical ideal, evaluated positively not for its own sake, but only for its contribution to national prosperity, social stability, and the cultural and political strength of the nation. Thus, Weber sought to locate marginalist economics within a broader framework. In doing so, however, Weber was in no way distancing himself from the theoretical achievements of marginalism, but only from the exaggerated faith of some of the marginalists, most notably Menger and Bumbaverk, in the virtues of economic liberalism. Thus Wieser, for example, saw economics in very similar terms to those of Weber and sought to develop his own approach to the subject along essentially Weberian lines, though Wieser's achievements were limited. Elsewhere in Europe, the most notable developments were those made in sometimes idiosyncratic ways by the Fabians, building on the economics of Wittgenstein. Thus, Weber was by no means alone in seeing in marginalist economic analysis the foundations on which a liberal reformist but non-Marxist theory of society could be built. The starting point of Weber's sociology was his insistence on the historical specificity of capitalist modernity. Marginalism offered an economic theory that was appropriate to a society within which this was indeed the characteristic value orientation. But in taking economic rationality as a psychological absolute, it ignored the question of the limits of its validity. The first task of sociology was to mark out those limits by establishing a typology of value orientations, within which capitalist rationality would be only one possible orientation to action. This would make it possible to view the institutions and modes of economic action characteristic of a capitalist society within their historical context. The basis of this investigation for Weber could only be the comparative and historical study of different societies. Weber's comparative and historical writings are well known. In them, he sought to locate the specific defining characteristics of capitalist rationality and the historical source of that rationality in the development of Christianity, and on this basis to contrast Christianity with other great world religions and to trace the development of the institutional framework of modern capitalism, including capitalism's legal, political, and cultural institutions, as aspects of the development of the particular ethical orientation of capitalist rationality. These studies are of value in their own right, but we are concerned with them only in their role in the development of Weber's systematic sociology. From this point of view, the purpose of the studies was to permit the elaboration of a series of ideal types that would provide the conceptual framework of that sociology. Weber elaborated these ideal typical concepts systematically in his book Economy and Society, a work that is fragmentary and incomplete, but within which the general thrust of Weber's sociology is clear. The fundamental concept of sociology for Weber is the concept of social action. Quote, "Sociology is a science concerning itself with the interpretive understanding of social action, and thereby with a causal explanation of its course and consequences. We shall speak of action insofar as the acting individual attaches a subjective meaning to his behavior, be it overt or covert, omission or acquiescence. Action is, quote, social, insofar as its subjective meaning takes account of the behavior of others and is thereby oriented in its course." End quote. Weber. Sociological explanation, therefore, aims to discover the source of social relations and social institutions in the meaningful orientation of individual social action. The primitive terms of sociology are not social relations, as they are for Marx, but the abstract individual of liberal social theory with given material interests in a given set of values. Since action is meaningful, it always involves the selection of means to an end on the basis of a particular value orientation. This provides one criterion according to which different types of action can be classified. Thus, Weber distinguishes 4 types of action according to their value orientation. The most fundamental type of action, which is the point of reference for the understanding of all types of action, is defined as, quote, instrumentally rational, that is, determined by expectations as to the behavior of objects in the environment and of other human beings. These expectations are used as, quote, conditions or, quote, means for the attainment of the actor's own rationally pursued and calculated ends, end quote. Weber. The other 3 types of action are all in some sense irrational. Value rational action is defined by the pursuit of a value for its own sake. Affectual action, quote, determined by the actor's special affects and feeling states, end quote, and traditional action, quote, determined by ingrained habituation, end quote. Weber. The difference between these four types of action seems at first sight to be fairly clear. However, this clarity is illusory and disappears as soon as any attempt is made to apply the classification. Nor are any of the alternative formulations offered by Weber any clearer. Although the typology defines distinctive value orientations of action, any attempt to apply the typology to the meanings that actions have for particular individuals runs into familiar problems connected with the attribution of motives. A consumer buying a packet of cornflakes in a supermarket may explain the actions in terms of either the instrumental rationality of consumer choice, the value rationality of a belief in the unique nutritive power of cornflakes, the effectual impact of the packaging, or tradition ingrained by habit. Weber was well aware of these problems, which is why he insisted that his ideal types related not to the actual meanings that actions have for particular individuals, but to the typical value orientations of hypothetical actors. Thus, in the formulation of typical explanations, the problem of attribution of motives does not arise. However, this does not dispel the problem, since Weber insists that his ideal types have validity only to the extent that his ideal types are amenable to empirical evaluation. Weber used his fourfold typology, particularly with reference to the motive's underlying recognition of the legitimacy of domination, but its practical usefulness is undermined here precisely by the problem of attribution of motives. Even at the typical level, it is by no means clear that the latter three motives can be distinguished from one another. Thus, Weber's fourfold typology effectively broke down into a dualistic typology, a rational and irrational action. Most of Weber's systematic sociology involving the application of the contrast between rational and traditional or customary action, the concept of charisma, has a special role to play, but I shall leave it aside here. In its fullest development, instrumental rationality is characteristic only of a capitalist society. So the concept of, quote, traditional, or more generally, irrational action, is a residual category that covers the typical orientation of action in all non-capitalist societies. Hence, although Weber included very extensive discussion of types of traditional action in his work, the analytical value of the typology was simply to demarcate capitalist from non-capitalist societies. Thus, the pivot of Weber's comparative historical and theoretical sociology is the distinctiveness of, quote, formal or, quote, instrumental rationality. Weber recognized that the concept of rationality enjoyed a special privilege in his sociology, but insisted that this privilege was only a methodological privilege. The ideal type of rational action, quote, has the merit of clear understandability and lack of ambiguity. By comparison with this, it is possible to understand the ways in which actual action is influenced by irrational factors of all sorts, such as effects and affects and errors, in that they account for the deviation from the line of conduct which would be expected on the hypothesis that the action was purely rational, end quote. The implication is that if it is possible to propose a rational interpretation of a particular course of action, that course of action will fall under the ideal type of instrumentally... Hey, how's it going? Yeah, I did graduate. Yeah, I'm going back. But that was my neighbor. The implication is that if it is possible to propose a rational interpretation of a particular course of action, that course of action will fall under the ideal type of instrumental rational action. If it is not possible to construct such a rational interpretation, the action will fall under the ideal type of irrational action. Clearly, a great deal depends on the meaning of rationality. As a formal concept, rationality implies no substantive judgments and refers essentially only to the consistency with which somebody acts. In this sense, beliefs are rational if they are non-contradictory, and action is rational if it is consistent with beliefs. However, in this sense, the rationality of actors is a necessary condition for the intelligibility of action, and so a necessary presupposition of any attempted interpretation or explanation. Thus, if rationality referred to formal rationality, in this sense, then all meaningful behavior, in other words, all action, would be rational. If the specific characteristic of rational social action cannot be characterized by a formal rational value orientation, in the sense just discussed, it must have some substantive content. Instrumental rationality is supposedly distinctive in that instrumental rationality is a form of rationality which is indifferent to the substantive content of the values pursued, whereas in other forms of action, the substantive content of those values dictates a particular course of action. The archetypal form of instrumental rational action is rational economic action, in which the market provides a means by which individuals may satisfy their wants, whatever may be the content of those wants. In this sense, the market imposes no substantive constraints on the wants, which may be satisfied by its means. Similarly, bureaucracy defines a rational form of administration, whatever may the ends which those in command of the bureaucracy may choose to pursue. Thus, Weber's characterization of the, quote, formal or, quote, instrumental rationality of the typical forms of action in a capitalist society seems to be based on an extension of the marginalist concept of economic rationality, according to which the fundamental economic institutions of capitalist society have a purely instrumental significance in providing a means of achieving human ends, which is indifferent to the ends pursued, in imposing no substantive constraints on the individuals who enter those institutions. On the other hand, Weber also recognizes that from an alternative evaluative standpoint, the consequences of such instrumental rationality are to be judged substantively irrational. Thus, the rule of the competitive market is fundamentally inconsistent with the attempt to order life in accordance with the values of equality, fraternity, and brotherly love, while bureaucratic domination is inconsistent with the values of freedom and personal autonomy. The implication is that the rationality of the market or of bureaucratic domination is not purely formal, but also involves substantive evaluative judgments, in particular, the judgment that, quote, the end justifies the means, end quote. The rationality of the market or of bureaucracy is defined in relation to the single-minded pursuit of monetary gain or of political and administrative domination. And so, far from being, quote, instrumentally rational, end quote, is archetypically, quote, value rational, end quote. This issue is obviously fundamental because, as we have seen in the last chapter, the validity of the abstraction of marginalist economics and of the definition of sociology as a complementary but autonomous discipline hinges on the validity of the economist's abstraction of the, quote, formal rationality, end quote, of economic action, and of the institutions typically derived therefrom, from any substantive considerations. If economics is considered not with the rational allocation of resources, but with fundamental value conflicts, expressing fundamental conflicts of material and ethical class interest, then there is no basis on which the quote economic can be abstracted from the quote social. Weber only conceals the substantive implications of instrumental rationality from himself by regarding such implications as the quote unintended consequences, end quote, of instrumentally rational action. However, this argument cannot be sustained, for one of the defining features of instrumental rationality is the anticipation of the results of such action, and it can hardly be claimed that the substantively irrational results of such action cannot be anticipated. Not only can such results be anticipated, but they also determine the resistance to such action on the part of those who are the object of its substantively irrational effects. A resistance which Weber recognizes as being inherent in such action, in recognizing that economic, political, and legal rationality are not indifferent modes of action, but are modes of domination. Before developing the implications of this criticism, we need to explore more closely the connection between marginalist economics and Weber's sociology. The marginalist foundations of Weber's sociology. Drink time. Although Weber takes the marginalist characterization of the formal rationality of economic action as his model, Weber regards economic action as only one manifestation of a formally rational orientation to action. Action may be classified not only on the basis of actions may be classified not only on the basis of their typical value orientations, but also according to the types of end to which they are directed. Thus, economic action is distinguished from political or religious action according to the goals that are pursued in each case. It is on the basis of the distinctive goals of economic action that Weber argued that the abstraction of economic theory is legitimate. Marginalist economics provides an adequate theory of the economic consequences of the pure type of rational economic action. Although Weber rejected the tendency of economic liberalism to make economic rationality an absolute ethical ideal, at the expense of cultural, moral, religious, and political ideals, Weber defended the autonomy of economic theory and correspondingly of economic sociology on the basis of the distinctiveness of the mode of orientation of economic action that makes it legitimate to abstract from consideration of action oriented to non-economic ends. Political or religious action are not oriented to economic gain, even though political and religious actions may have economic implications. Political or religious actions are therefore considered as, quote, economically oriented actions, end quote, not as, quote, economic actions, end quote. Thus, although economic action depends on the existence of a legal and political order, it is legitimate to analyze economic action in abstraction from that order. Any particular economic action will, of course, be undertaken in the light of the existence of such an order. But from the point of view of theoretical investigation, such an order must be taken as given. Correspondingly, the legal, political, and religious orders must be the subject of investigation, however much they might be influenced in practice by economic factors, in accordance with the distinctive modes of orientation of their typical forms of action. Weber had no objections to the marginalist theory of the economy, provided only that the marginalist theory of the economy knew its own limits. Thus, Weber constantly stressed that he was not offering an alternative economic theory, and that he did not wish to become involved in economist disputes. He insisted that, quote, theoretical insights, end quote, of economic theory, quote, provide the basis for the sociology of economic action, end quote, which did not in any way call them into question. Weber's task was merely to elaborate the sociological concepts implicit in such an economic theory. His scheme is, quote, intentionally limited to sociological concepts, restricts itself to working out a sociological typology, to supply a scaffolding, to develop a systematic scheme of classification, end quote. The fundamental concept implicit in economic theory is the concept of, quote, rational economic action, end quote. The first task of Weber's economic sociology was, therefore, to elaborate this concept and to establish the connections between this concept and the fundamental institutions of capitalist society. This elaboration involved Weber in elucidating the social theory implicit in marginalist economics. Weber began his discussion of the, quote, sociological categories of economic action, end quote, with a series of fundamental definitions. Quote, action will be said to be, quote, economically oriented, end quote, so far as according to that action's subjective meaning. It is concerned with the satisfaction of a desire for, quote, utilities, end quote. Quote, economic action, end quote, is any peaceful exercise of an actor's control over resources, which is in its main impulse oriented towards economic ends. Quote, rational economic action, end quote, requires instrumental rationality in this orientation. That is deliberate planning, end quote. Weber. Rational economic action therefore involved primarily the systematic orientation of production and exchange to the acquisition of utilities through the allocation of resources in conditions of scarcity. The definition of rational economic action made no reference to the conditions under which such action was carried out, but referred only to the subjective orientation of action. However, such action necessarily involved the quantification of alternative courses of action in order that the alternatives could be rationally evaluated. Hence, rational economic action presupposed the possibility of economic calculation. In principle, rational action was possible, quote, where calculation is carried out in terms of physical units, end quote. However, such action could only be based on the subjective evaluation of utilities and disutilities, which Weber claimed raised serious difficulties, so that, quote, the actual solution is usually found partly by the application of purely traditional standards, partly by making very rough estimates. As accounting in kind becomes completely rational and is emancipated from tradition, the estimation of marginal utilities in terms of the relative urgency of wants encounters grave complications, whereas if it were carried out in terms of monetary wealth and income, it would be relatively simple, end quote. Consequently, quote, "From a purely technical point of view, money is the most, quote, perfect, end quote, means of economic calculation. That is, money is formally the most rational means of orienting economic activity. Calculation in terms of money is thus the specific means of rational economic provision." End quote. Weber. The possibility of properly rational economic action depended on the possibility of monetary calculation. Thus, the development of rational economic action was identified with the development of the, quote, formal rationality of economic action, end quote, which was defined as, quote, the extent of quantitative calculation or accounting which is technically possible, which is actually applied, end quote. Weber. And this possibility was identified in turn with the development of monetary accounting. Economic action was initially defined in terms of an orientation of action to the satisfaction of a desire for utilities. Such action would take place within the context of a budgetary unit, such as the household. Budgetary accounting sought to relate anticipated needs to anticipated resources. Quote, the possibility of complete monetary budgeting for the budgetary unit is dependent on the possibility that its income and wealth consist either in money or in goods, which are at any time subject to exchange for money, that is, which are in the highest degree marketable. End quote. Weber. The formal rationality of economic action in the budgetary unit, therefore, depended on the generalization of commodity production. Fully rational economic action is possible for a budgetary unit only within a developed capitalist society. Exchange in a developed market economy takes place on the basis of the equalization of relative prices and relative marginal utilities. This equalization takes place not only contemporaneously, but also over time. According to some versions of marginal utility theory to which Weber adhered, economic actors have an irrational preference for present as against equivalent future goods. According to this theory, this time preference is the basis of profit, since the price of goods which take time to produce must be marked up in order to compensate those who have provided capital for the loss of utility involved in waiting for its return. Although time preference is a universal phenomenon, it only becomes the basis of profit within a developed market economy, within which resources can be allocated in accordance with relative marginal utilities. Thus, within such an economy, we find the emergence of the profit-making enterprise, oriented to the acquisition of profit, and differentiated from the budgetary unit. The emergence of such an enterprise expresses the orientation of economic actors to the rational allocation of resources over time. Because of their different orientations to action, it is essential to rational economic action that the budgetary unit and the profit-making enterprise should be separate from one another. Thus, quote, from the point of view of business interest, the interest in maintaining the private wealth of the owner is often irrational, as is his interest in income receipts at any given time from the point of view of the profitability of the enterprise. This fact implies the separation of a matter of principle of the budgetary unit and the enterprise, even where both with respect to the powers of control and objects controlled are identical. End quote. Weber. The formal rationality of economic action in the profit-making enterprise depends on the commodity character and free disposal of resources under its control. thus the, quote, principal conditions necessary for obtaining a maximum of formal rationality of capital accounting in production enterprises, end quote, are defined as, quote, the complete appropriation of all material means of production by owners, end quote. This involves the freedom of markets, subordination of management to ownership, free labor and free labor markets, freedom of contract, a, quote, mechanically rational technology, end quote, quote, formally rational administration and law, end quote, quote, the most complete separation possible of the enterprise from the household or budgetary unit, end quote, and, quote, a monetary system with the highest possible degree of formal rationality, end quote. In short, the competitive capitalist economy of marginalist economics. The generalization of the market economy was not only the condition of rational accounting, and so the formal rationality of economic action, but also the condition of the, quote, technically rational organization of the work process, end quote. This was firstly because of the, quote, sheer superiority and actual indispensability of a type of management oriented to the particular market situations, end quote, where, quote, management has extensive control over the selection and modes of use of workers, end quote, and where, quote, free labor and the complete appropriation of the means of production create the most favorable conditions for discipline, end quote. Secondly, it was because the fear of starvation gave those without substantial property an incentive to work, while it provided incentives to enterprise for those with property. For all his insistence on the culturally specific character of economic rationality, it turns out that Weber's account of the conditions of rational action reformulates in more rigorous terms the explanation of the fundamental institutions of capitalist society already presented by marginalist economics, and most notably by Menger, on the basis of a universalistic conception of rationality. The institutions of private property in the means of production, exchange, the division of labor, money, wages, prices, and profits were all conditions for and expressions of the formal rationality of economic action. It was this account, which I criticized in the last chapter, that was the foundation of Weber's sociology. The distinctiveness of Weber's contribution lay not in his, quote, economic sociology, end quote, but in his situating the formal abstraction of marginalist economics within a broader analytical framework, thereby creating the possibility of developing sociology, not in opposition to economics, but as an autonomous and complementary discipline. To see the basis of this contribution, we need to turn to Weber's methodology. Economy and society. The analysis of marginalist economics is conducted at a very high level of abstraction. Marginalist economics presents itself as a formal analysis of the ideal conditions and consequences of rational economic action in abstraction from any particular society. Economics thus studies the eternal and ahistorical forms of reason, and so is a deductive a priori enterprise. Throughout the 1800s, as we have seen, various schools of, quote, sociology emerged to complement or contest the abstraction of economics. Sociology studying the contingent institutional and moral framework within which the economic forms appear. This is in essence the opposition between marginalism and the German historical school. The relationship between economics and sociology was always one of tension, as neither was able to accommodate the other. Thus in the Methodenstreit, Menger and Schmoller each claimed to have discovered the only appropriate form of knowledge of society. Menger criticized historicism on the grounds that knowledge necessarily involved the formation of general laws, while Schmoller criticized marginalism for trying to apply its abstract laws to reality. In his methodological writings, Weber sought to achieve a reconciliation of the two positions, in arguing that theory is necessary to historical explanation, while denying that theory in the social sciences could be a distinctive form of knowledge with its own independent validity. The deductive method of economics produced only hypotheses in the form of ideal types, which were necessary to historical understanding, but whose explanatory power lay only in the historical relationships they illuminated. Sociologists have pored over Weber's methodological writings to find the key to the sociological method, but Weber's, quote, ideal types, end quote, hang on easily between descriptive categories and explanatory concepts without ever resolving the tension between the two. The ambiguity of the concept of the ideal type focuses the methodological dilemma without resolving it. However, Weber's real achievement lay not in formulating a prescriptive methodology for the social sciences, but in achieving a substantive reconciliation of economics and sociology, so as to make possible a unified, though differentiated, liberal social theory. Weber's typology of action ascribed a particular place within the social sciences to economic theory. Economic theory was concerned to elaborate the economic conditions for and implications of the pure type of rational economic action. Foremost among the economic conditions for rational economic action were the fundamental institutions of capitalist society: private property, the market, money, the division of labor, wages, and profits. These institutions were therefore explained at the level of abstraction of economic theory as instrumental expressions of economic rationality. Although these institutions were the manifestation of historically specific social relations that have developed in the course of the production and reproduction of human social existence, they were not conceptualized at this level of abstraction as specific historical developments, but as the embodiment of an abstract and ahistorical rational principle. Sociology cannot rest content with such an abstract deductive account of the structure of capitalist society. Society is not made by metaphysical principles, but by real people, interacting with one another on the basis of their particular needs and aspirations. If sociology were to be reconciled with economic theory, it needed to situate the abstractions of economic theory within the concrete framework of everyday social life. Weber's typology of action made this possible, locating economic theory as one among several branches of social science concerned with the abstract investigation of one dimension of social life. Economics alone could not give knowledge of concrete societies. Such knowledge could only be achieved by the totality of the social sciences. Economic sociology was concerned to locate the abstractions of economic theory within the concrete reality of social action, while other branches of sociology concern themselves with the conditions for and implications of action oriented to non-economic ends. Although economic theory was only one branch of the social sciences, economic theory nevertheless enjoyed an especially privileged position. However much the institutions abstractly theorized by economics were located historically, however much the historian and the sociologist explored the specific socio-historical circumstances within which they came into being, they remained also the supra-historical manifestations of reason, and so the universal foundations of a society characterized by its formal rationality, capitalism. Weber recognized the crudity of Menger's account of the origins of the fundamental institutions of capitalist society, according to which one individual rationally appreciated the advantage of, for example, money, and was then imitated by others. Thus Weber recognized that the origins of capitalism lay in the struggles for power and material gain of an earlier age, so that money, credit, exchange, the separation of labor from the means of production were all developed by particular interests seeking their own advantage. But this particularity of origin did not undermine the identification of these institutions with formal rationality. It merely meant that progressive rationalization of economic action was an uneven and discontinuous process that was often compromised by particular interests. Universal significance of all these institutions remained their formal rationality, not the particularity of their origin. Economic theory had this special status because the rationality on which it was based, and which was expressed in monetary calculation, was supposedly a purely formal rationality. The institutions to which it gave rise were therefore the instruments of reason, the institutional forms of a universal principle, and so the presuppositions and foundations of rational social action, and not the products of specific actions. Hence the theoretical status of an explanation of market exchange as, quote, the archetype of all rational social action, end quote, was quite different from that of an explanation of a particular exchange relation in terms of the needs, aspirations, and circumstances of particular individuals who meet in the market. The market provided a formal framework within which rational social action takes place, without dictating the terms of exchange, and so the content of that action. A particular exchange may even involve an attempt to subvert the rationality of the market by violating its principles. But in that case, the exchange eschewed not only the principles of the market, but also the principles of rationality. Economic theory, and its concept of rational economic action, was therefore the foundation of any sociological investigation of capitalist society, in providing the formal framework that was the condition of possibility of rational action. It was for sociology to fill this framework with social content. Sociology should not be concerned with singular acts, but with, quote, courses of action that are repeated by the actor or simultaneously occur among numerous actors, since the subjective meaning is meant to be the same, end quote. Such repetition may be simply the manifestation of usage, custom, or habit, sustained by inertia and convenience. Alternatively, it may, as an economic theory, be a manifestation of the repeated rational appreciation of identical situations, and so be explicable in terms of rational self-interest. However, it may also be the result of an orientation of action to a legitimate order of normative regulation, whether in the form of convention or of law. Convention is a spontaneous form of normative regulation, emerging out of social relations. Law is a compulsory form of regulation imposed by an organization. An adequate account of social action, including economic action, had to consider not only the rational orientation to self-interest, but also the formation of an orientation to the legitimate orders of social organization, where the economic institutions of the market, money, etc., provided the necessary formal framework for rational social action. The social institutions of organizations, with their legitimate orders, provided its contingent historical framework. It was on this basis that Weber differentiated, quote, economy and, quote, society, quote, economics and, quote, sociology. Economics remained a deductive discipline, establishing the formal instrumental rationality of the fundamental institutions of capitalist society. These institutions provided the framework within which actors, through their meaningful interaction with others, engaged in social action and created concrete social relations and concrete social institutions. Weber's sociology was primarily concerned with establishing a typology of organizations according to the ends which motivate those organizations' formation and inform their direction. The means available to those ends, the value orientation of action typical to them, and their internal dynamics. It was quite possible, and indeed very likely, that the formation of these organizations would subvert the formal rationality of the competitive market system, for they were established precisely to achieve ends that could not be achieved directly through rational economic action. The existence of organizations could not simply be taken as given. Their origins had to be sought in the individual actions that give rise to those organizations and sustain them. Such, quote, collectivities must be treated solely as the resultants and modes of organization of the particular acts of individual persons, since acts of individual persons alone can be treated as agents in the course of subjectively understandable action. End quote. Weber. Although they are singular products, organizations may be classified according to the typical orientation of action that gives rise to them. Thus, economic organizations are established and administered with a view to achieving economic ends. The budgetary unit as an economic organization is oriented to the satisfaction of a desire for utilities, and the profit-making enterprise is oriented to making profits. Other economic organizations will arise on the basis of economic interests, as individuals with a common interest associate in order to advance that interest, usually by monopolizing advantages and so regulating exchange in their own interests. The most notable such organizations are trade unions and cartels. Organizations will also be formed to further the pursuit of non-economic ends. A political organization is an organization in which the membership is subject to domination by an established order, which is maintained within a certain territorial order by the threat of force. A political organization is therefore directed to the attainment and imposition of coercive power. In contemporary society, the only strictly political organization in this sense is the state, which claims a monopoly of the means of physical force. However, the state determines the existence of a political economy. However, the state determines the existence of a political community within which politically oriented action, that is to say, action oriented to affecting the direction of the state, is channeled through political parties. A, quote, hierocratic organization, end quote, is one, quote, which enforces its order through physic coercion by psychic coercion. Let me restart that whole thing. A, quote, hierocratic organization, end quote, is an organization, quote, which enforces its order through a psychic coercion by distributing or denying religious benefits, end quote. Weber. Religious action is the action of such an organization. Religiously oriented action is action oriented to influencing the direction of the organization. Hierocratic organizations were particularly important for Weber because hierocratic organizations were defined by their orientation to and imposition of ideal ends, and as such could influence the value orientation of action in all spheres of life. Organizations may also be classified according to the means adopted by those in authority to achieve their ends. Any organization that is more than a spontaneous voluntary association will be characterized by a system of domination which will typically involve an administrative staff and a system of legal regulation, according to the value orientation of action typical of the leadership of the organization. There will be typically different forms of law and of domination. Thus, Weber developed an elaborate typology of such forms as the core of his sociology of law and his sociology of domination. Weber insisted on the autonomy of political and religious ends in relation to economic ends. Political action is directed to the achievement of political power for its own sake, not as a means to material gain. Religious action is oriented to ideas for their own sake, and not to provide a moral gloss for material interests. The ideal types of action and corresponding organization must be formulated in abstraction from one another. However, in reality it is true that the autonomy of economic, political, and religious action is not maintained. Thus, churches, states, political parties have to engage in economic action to sustain themselves as corporate entities and may intervene in economic life to achieve their political and religious ends. Economic actors and economic organizations may orient their activity to political and religious organizations to achieve their economic ends. Thus, a cartel may seek political favor, a trade union legal protection, and a party religious sanction. Financiers may encourage the state to increase its indebtedness. Industrialists may encourage the state to protect them from competition. Imperialists may encourage the state's expansionism. And capitalists may seek to use the state to oppress the working class. None of these practical relationships, however, undermine the fact that for Weber, the state and the church were in essence autonomous and directed to other than economic ends. If that autonomy was destroyed, they would cease to be political or religious organizations. It is this typology of action that defines the place of the concept of, quote, class in Weber's sociology. Classes arise as associations of individuals pursuing a common economic interest. Weber defined a class as, quote, all persons in the same class situation, end quote. A, quote, class situation, end quote, being defined in terms as, quote, the typical probability of 1. Procuring goods, 2. Attaining a position in life, and 3. Finding inner satisfactions, a probability which derives from the relative control over goods and skills and from their income-producing uses within a given economic order, end quote. Weber. The concept of class situation therefore refers to a common economic interest that derives from a common economic situation, defined in terms either of the possession or absence of property, quote, property class, end quote, or of the type of economic activity, for example, the branch of production of an entrepreneur or the occupation of a worker, quote, commercial class, end quote. A social class is then defined as, quote, the totality of those class situations within which individual and generational mobility is easy and typical, end quote. Thus, social classes are defined as the working class, the petite bourgeoisie, the propertyless intelligentsia, and specialists, and the, quote, classes privileged with property and education, end quote. Although the concept of social class defines a common interest among, for example, workers in different occupations, or entrepreneurs in different branches of production, because of the possibilities of social mobility between them, there is no reason why individuals should necessarily be aware of their common class situation, still less why they should necessarily establish class organizations on that basis. Quote, a uniform class situation prevails only when completely unskilled and propertyless persons are dependent on irregular employment. Mobility among and stability of class positions differs greatly, hence the unity of a social class is highly variable, end quote. Weber. Class situation is only one basis of economic organization, and one that does not easily succeed because of class divisions. It goes without saying that the concept of class is not appropriate to the conceptualization of action directed to non-economic ends, however much class factors may contingently intrude on the activity of such organizations as parties or status groups. Thus, there is no more justification for reducing the uniformities of social action to the single concept of class than there is for reducing them to rational self-interest. Conflicts of economic interest are inevitable. So there is an inherent tendency to class formation in capitalist societies. But classes may be more or less significant groupings at different historical periods. Correspondingly, there will be a greater or lesser tendency for class factors to play a role in the formation of parties and status groups. However, such interdependencies have to be investigated empirically as those interdependencies arise and cannot prejudice the essential autonomy of ends on the basis of which different forms of action, organization, and social relation arise. Weber's sociology offered a pluralistic conception of society that he contrasted with the, quote, reductionism, end quote, of both Marxism and vulgar economic liberalism. Although economic theory defined the formal framework of a rational economic system, economic theory did not specify its concrete historical content. In pursuing their economic, political, and religious or ethical interests, individuals create a range of social relationships and social organizations that provide the institutional environment within which social life takes place. The variety and complexity of social existence cannot be reduced to uniform expressions of the rational pursuit of self-interest. Such a reduction ignores the importance of ethical and political goals in social life and ignores the prevalence of custom and tradition and of effectual orientations to action even in a capitalist society. Hence, an adequate theory of society has to complement economic theory with sociology. Weber's pluralistic conception of society bases its differentiation of types of action and of social institution on the differentiation of the substantive ends typical of each kind of action. For Weber, the differentiation of social institutions, according to the typical ends to which they are adapted, is not a universal feature of society, but is itself the historical result of the progressive rationalization of society. On the model of the rationality of the economic division of labor, the functional differentiation of institutions is, quote, efficient, end quote, in the sense that each specialized institution can select appropriate means to achieve its distinctive ends. However, this does not mean that each type of action and each type of institution defines an independent sphere, for each has implications for the other. As we have seen, the economic reproduction of the state and the church has to be secured, while the reproduction of typically economic institutions presupposes certain political and ethical conditions. Moreover, these different ends are not necessarily consistent with one another. The attempt of the church to realize religious ends may be compromised if the church has to preoccupy itself with economic concerns, just as the economic reproduction of the business enterprise is compromised if its operation is subordinate to other than purely economic ends. The rationality of the functional differentiation of social institutions, according to the typical ends pursued, derives precisely from the potential conflict between the requirements of those distinct ends. The differentiation of institutions does not eliminate this conflict, but only externalizes this conflict, so that the problem now arises in the relationship between institutions. Recognition of this conflict between competing ends was precisely the problem from which Weber embarked on his sociological enterprise. In his work on the Prussian peasants, Weber showed that the unrestrained pursuit of economic goals undermined the economic and political reproduction of the state. Thus, the objective tendency was for economic rationality to subvert political rationality. On the other hand, for Weber, political ends were superior to economic ends, from which he drew the conclusion that the exercise of economic rationality had to be morally and politically restrained. Although Weber rejected the reductionism of both Marxism and economic liberalism in espousing a pluralist conception of society, he believed that capitalist society had a coherence and a unity that was given by the typically rational orientation of action in capitalist society. However, this rational value orientation is not a specifically economic phenomenon. The rationalization of the capitalist economy is simply one aspect of a process that can also be observed in religion, in law, and in the characteristic forms of domination of Western European society. According to Weber, this process cannot be reduced to the requirements of economic rationality. On the contrary, the development of economic rationality is only one manifestation of the development of an instrumentally rational value orientation. The time has come to explore more closely just what this rationality involves. The typology of action and the theory of society. The basis of Weber's sociology was his typology of social action, which was the conceptual foundation of his entire scheme of ideal types. Marginalist economics took as its starting point the abstract individual, whose actions were determined according to the rational pursuit of economic ends, and developed the pure theory of rational economic action. However, Weber's typology of action established that rational economic action was only one among a variety of forms of social action, defined according to the value orientation of action and the ends to which that action was directed. Thus, economics is only one branch of the social sciences, building a theory of the institutions and social relations that can be regarded as ideal typically as the consequences of rational economic action. Sociology has to put economics in its place within the field of the social sciences, and has to complement economic theory with a comparable ideal typical investigation of those forms of action that cannot be characterized by a rational orientation to economic ends, and the institutions and social relations that arise on the basis of such action. The ideal typical investigation could not, for Weber, produce theoretical truths as a distinctive form of knowledge, but it did generate the fundamental concepts which provided the basis for comparative and historical investigation, and so for particular sociological explanations. The primitive concepts of Weber's sociology were, on the one hand, the abstract individual, and on the other hand, the value orientation of action and the ends to which that action was directed. A sociological explanation had been achieved once social action, social relations, and social institutions had been related back to the orientation to ends and values of the individuals whose actions gave rise to those social relations and social institutions. It was therefore fundamental to Weber's aim of establishing a conceptual foundation for the social sciences that the typology of ends and of value orientations be established prior to and independently of the social relations and social institutions to which they gave rise. If this were not the case, the ends and value orientations of action would in turn be amenable to sociological explanation, and they would cease to be primitive concepts of sociology. The typology of ends can be used to exemplify the argument, before we return to the typology of value orientations. The typology of ends was the basis on which Weber established the autonomy of economic, political, and ethical or religious action, and so of economics and other branches of the social sciences. Although Weber stressed that the ideal types could only be established by thorough comparative and historical investigation, the autonomy of these different forms of action and of the institutions and social relations to which they gave rise was not established empirically. Weber observed, for example, that political and religious means were frequently used to economic ends, and that success in achieving political and religious ends was frequently dependent on the availability of economic means. The basis of this differentiation is therefore not empirical but conceptual. However, if we ask what is the conceptual basis of the differentiation of ends, we find ourselves caught at once in a vicious circle. Economic action is action oriented to the provision of the material means of human existence. Defined in this stark way, the definition could be considered to be prior to the social institutions to which it gives rise, so that an instrumental explanation of these institutions is not coherent, although as soon as we look at a particular society, we might doubt the adequacy of this characterization. Provision for material needs is only secured through social production, so that action oriented to such provision has to be oriented to the social reproduction of the actor as an economic agent. If the substantive content of both the ends of economic action and the means at the disposal of the individual are necessarily socially defined, economic action cannot be categorized in abstraction from the particular institutional form of the social relations of production. Political and religious action are defined in terms of ends that have no meaning outside the institutions to which they supposedly give rise. Thus, political action is defined by an orientation to the exercise of political power, politically oriented action to the acquisition of such power. Political action, therefore, presupposes the existence of a political organization, without which political power does not exist. In the same way, religious action presupposes the existence of an hierocratic organization. Hence, the definition of the ends of social action presupposes the existence of precisely those social institutions which the typology of ends was set up to explain. The only way out of this vicious circle is to postulate an inherent irrational quest for power and metaphysical sustenance as a defining characteristic of the human psyche. This, however, is just the kind of psychologistic irrationalism which Weber sought to rescue the social sciences. The only conclusion must be that the explanation of the specific characteristics of economic, political, and religious action must itself be sociological and cannot be referred to the typology of ends, since that typology presupposes the phenomenon it seeks to explain. However, Weber did not draw this conclusion, characteristically falling back at this crucial point on his historicist empiricism, which insisted that historical interpretation is ultimately the only valid form of knowledge. The result was that the explanatory power of his sociology was limited to a potential ability to interpret the reproduction of those social phenomena on the basis of the subjective interpretation of socially determined and socially effective human needs and aspirations. Where am I? While the typology of ends established the autonomy of the different forms of action, and so of the different branches of the social sciences, the typology of While the typology of ends established the autonomy of the different forms of action, and so of the different branches of the social sciences, the typology of value orientation was the basis on which the coherence and unity of society was established. The cultural unity of a capitalist society was defined by the typically rational value orientation of action in such a society. I have already noted that the typology effectively reduces to the contrast between rational and irrational action, the distinctions between different types of irrational action referring to typical motivation rather than to typical value orientation. The typology, therefore, depends on the definition of the, quote, formal rationality, end quote, characteristic of a capitalist society. I have also noted that the definition of this formal rationality derives from the marginalist characterization of rational economic action. However, Weber insisted that the economy is only one sphere of application of the broader principles of instrumental rationality. Clearly, Weber's interpretation hinges on the characterization of the rationality of, quote, instrumentally rational action, end quote, independently of its economic form. It is fundamental to Weber's sociology that the formally rational value orientation can be defined abstractly and not reduced to the specific economic rationality of capitalist society. If this were not the case, his sociology would be threatened by a reductionism for which the characteristic value orientation of capitalist society would be the expression of capitalist economic rationality, so that the rationality of political and religious action would not be inherent in those forms of action, but would be an expression of their relation to economic action, and the rationality of economic action would in turn be the consequence and not the cause of capitalist economic institutions. We have seen that Weber insisted that economic rationality was only one form of rationality. We have seen that Weber insisted that economic rationality was only one form of rationality, and that the development of the capitalist economy was only one aspect of the rationalization of Western society. The Protestant ethic and the bureaucratic state are not expressions of the development of capitalist rationality. All three are, in principle, autonomous expressions of the development of a rational value orientation in all spheres of social life. However, we have already seen that formal rationality, in the sense of consistency and determinateness of relations between motives and actions, is a necessary condition for the intelligibility of action, and so a necessary condition for any interpretive sociology, without in any sense being sufficient for the definition of an instrumentally rational value orientation to action in Weber's sense. Weber's, quote, formal rationality, therefore, necessarily involves substantive considerations. In practice, Weber's explorations of irrational, quote, irrational forms of action were conducted on the basis of the presupposition of the formal rationality, in the logical sense, of all action. Thus he analyzed, for example, patrimonialism in terms of the rational requirements of administration appropriate to a particular society, and of the rational responses of different actors to the situations in which they found themselves. Patrimonialism, or calculation in kind, did not persist because of an irrational feature. Patrimonialism, or calculation in kind, did not persist because of an irrational failure to adapt means to ends, but because the means for a more, quote, rational adaptation were not available. The means for more, quote, rational adaptation were not available. The, quote, rationality of the forms of action typical of a particular society lay not so much in the subjective orientation of the actors as in the extent to which the social institutions in which their actions were embedded had been subordinated to the principles of a particular form of rationality, quote, instrumental or, quote, formal rationality. Thus, the, quote, irrationality of patrimonialism and calculation in kind was measured against the, quote, rationality of bureaucratic administration and monetary calculation, as less against more adequate means of achieving the given end. Measured against other ends, however, patrimonialism and calculation in kind might appear rational, while bureaucratic administration and monetary calculation would be irrational. Thus, the privileged status of, quote, formal rationality in Weber's sociology does not lie simply in its expressing the rational adaptation of means to ends. So what is peculiarly rational about, quote, formal rationality? Weber's definition of formal rationality differed according to the sphere of activity with which he was concerned. Thus, economic rationality referred to economic action and was defined in terms of the extent of money calculation. However, such a definition was obviously not appropriate to the characterization of rational forms of law, domination, or religion. Each of these was characterized in turn in its own way. Thus, rationality was expressed in formal law, bureaucratic domination, and a secularized religion. The common feature of all these cases was the determination of a course of action in accordance with a set of general rules, rather than a particular prescription or a capricious whim. Very broadly, the degree of rationality was identified with the degree of generality of the rules applied to the determination of a particular course of action, and so with the relative absence of particularistic regulation.
On what basis is the degree of abstraction of regulations identified with the degree of rationality? Weber suggests that the rationality of such a system lies in the degree to which the consequences of action are predictable. It is certainly the case that the existence of a set of rules makes it possible to predict with some degree of accuracy the decisions of a legal, bureaucratic, or hierocratic authority, and so to anticipate the consequences of a particular course of action. The peculiar, quote, rationality of such a set of institutions is not defined by the subjective orientation of the actor, calculating the consequences of action, but by the objective, quote, rationality provided by the degree of predictability of those consequences, which is made possible by the existence of a set of rules. Although the decisions of a despotic ruler might not be governed by a legal system, this does not imply that those living under a despotic administration will have to abandon rationality. It merely means that they will have to base their calculations on their knowledge of the considerations of the despot, will be likely to bring to bear on their case. To the extent that despotic rule is capricious, such calculation will involve considerable indeterminacy. The predictability of the imperative judgments of others certainly makes it easier to anticipate the consequences of a particular course of action, so making it more likely that the end achieved will be the end intended. However, the predictability of the consequences of action is by no means the exclusive prerogative of an abstract system of regulation. The rule of custom and tradition, or even the decisions of a despot, may attain at least a high degree of predictability. Thus, the peculiar rationality of an abstract system of regulation cannot lie simply in the predictability of its decisions. The other feature of such a system that Weber emphasized is its impersonality, quote, impersonality. An abstract system of regulation not only makes it possible to anticipate with some degree of accuracy the consequences of a particular action, but it also applies to every individual without regard to their personal characteristics or social status. However, there is nothing inherently rational about such a system. Indeed, Weber recognized that the abstract character of the system implied that it would be, quote, substantively irrational, end quote. For the fact that the same set of rules, applied regardless of personal circumstances, meant that the substantive consequences of those rules would differ from person to person. Freedom of contract was the freedom of the capitalist to appropriate surplus value, and the freedom of the worker to submit to the direction of the capitalist. The same freedom is the freedom for the enrichment of the one and the enslavement of the other. The application of the abstract principle of equality before the law in an unequal society is a means and a condition for the reproduction of that inequality. This may be rational for the rich, but its rationality for the poor is by no means obvious. Exclamation point. Weber was undoubtedly correct to argue that monetary calculation, formal law, and bureaucratic domination could not be identified completely with capitalism. So that instrumental rationality could not be referred to the interest of a particular class. Monetary calculation, formal legal systems, and bureaucratic domination long preceded the development of modern capitalism and arise in societies and in areas of social life that apparently have little or no connection with capitalist economic forms. However, they do seem to be closely associated with the development of commercial and money capital on the basis of the growth of commodity production, which are phenomena that are historically very much older and geographically far more widespread than capitalist forms of production. More importantly, it is their association with the competitive regulation of economic activity, which only comes to fruition with the development of modern capitalism, that marks these impersonal forms of regulation as, quote, rational in comparison with any alternative forms. This is quite simply because the competitive regulation of economic activity requires the freedom of action from particular legal, political, and religious constraints. The decisions of legal, political, and religious authorities will have economic implications. Competitive regulation requires that these implications should be not only predictable, but that they do not favor one branch of economic activity or one actor against another. However, this immediately implies that the rationality, the quote rationality of abstract forms of legal, political, and hierarchic regulation is not derived from the subjective rationality of individual actors, since each actor would prefer to secure preferential treatment, while all others are subject to anonymous regulation. Nor is this rationality inherent in the characteristic legal, political, and religious ends pursued. For it is often antithetical to such substantive legal, political, and religious considerations as, quote, justice, quote, power, or, quote, salvation. The rationality of these abstract and impersonal forms of regulation can only be derived from the objective rationality of competitive forms of economic regulation. Abstract forms of regulation are, quote, rational, and their rationality is, quote, formal, because they do not have substantive implications for the outcome of the competitive process, and so do not undermine the rationality inherent in the latter. Thus we find ourselves back with the marginalist characterization of the abstract rationality of capitalism as the foundation of the general principle of rationality, not merely as one of its manifestations. Weber's, quote, formal rationality, end quote, as the subjective orientation to action typical of modern society, reduces to the marginalist, quote, economic rationality as the objective characteristic of capitalist economic institutions. The same might be argued of religious belief. Weber recognized that it is not possible to characterize any system of belief as inherently more rational than any other. Thus, the this-worldly asceticism of Calvinism, that is the defining characteristic of the Protestant ethic, is not in itself any more rational than alternative systems of religious belief. What gives particular sorts of religious belief a privileged rationality within Weber's scheme is not their inherent qualities, but the fact that they do not impede, or that they actually promote, the development of economic, legal, and bureaucratic rationality. In short, the development of capitalism. Thus, the Protestant ethic may be very rational in a capitalist society, since hard work and frugality are the necessary qualities of a good wage laborer, while savings and the reinvestment of profits are the key to survival as a capitalist. But it is only within an emerging capitalist society, in which the accumulation of the products of labor becomes the basis of social production and the means to the accumulation of wealth, that the, quote, this worldly asceticism, end quote, of the Protestant ethic furthers the development of the social relations of capitalist production. In a different kind of society, hard work and frugality would lead merely to the accumulation of useless things, which may be devoted to the glorification of God or the relief of the poor, but which would have no other social significance. In themselves, the Protestant ethic, formal law, and bureaucratic domination are no more rational than any other forms. It is only their privileged relationship to capitalist economic rationality that makes their designation as, quote, rational an appropriate designation. We have to conclude that bureaucratic, legal, religious, and economic rationality are not independent manifestations of a purely formal principle of rationality. The rationality of the first three is conditional on the rationality of the last one. Thus, the characterization of the institutions and social relations of capitalist society as being rational depends on the characterization of the rationality of economic action in a capitalist society. Weber identified the, quote, formal rationality of rational economic action with the possibility and extent of money calculations. From this he derived the rationality of the fundamental institutions of capitalist society, the generalization of commodity production and exchange, the separation of the laborer from the means of production, the separation of the household from the productive enterprise, the separation of ownership from control of the means of production, the development of the joint stock company, the credit system, etc., are all rational developments because they extend the scope of money calculation. The question we have to ask is, in what sense is money calculation especially rational? Can money calculation's rationality be defined in purely formal terms? Or does the rationality of money calculation depend on the presupposition of the substantive rationality of capitalist social relations? Is capitalism the expression of the rationality of economic action, or is money calculation simply the form of economic rationality appropriate to capitalism? Does capitalism express the development of economic rationality, or does economic rationality express the development of capitalism? Economic action is rational when it involves an instrumentally rational orientation to the satisfaction of a desire for utilities. To what extent is monetary calculation a condition of such rationality? Weber asserted that monetary calculation on the part of the budgetary unit was more rational than calculation in kind because of the reliance of calculation in kind on the subjective evaluation of advantages, which made it impossible to quantify alternatives objectively. This fundamental argument is fallacious and almost trivially so in view of Weber's conception of sociology. Calculations in kind undoubtedly involve the subjective evaluation of the benefits that flow from alternative dispositions of resources. But this is no less true of monetary calculations. In the latter case, the budgetary unit has to decide how much of each available good to sell and how much of each good offered on the market to buy at prevailing market prices. Money is the means of comparison, but what is being compared is the subjective evaluation of alternative courses of action on the basis of anticipated marginal contributions to utility in each case. Since subjective evaluation is the defining characteristic of action for Weber, calculation in money is a no more rational means of allocating resources in accordance with considerations of utility than is calculation in kind. Money calculation cannot be characterized as peculiarly rational on the basis of the value orientation of individual action, but only on the basis of the supposedly superior rationality of monetary prices over subjective evaluations of utility. In other words, the supposed rationality of monetary calculation has nothing to do with its subjective rationality, but derives from the supposed objective rationality of the market through which monetary prices are determined. Thus the supposed, quote, formal rationality, end quote, of monetary accounting presupposes the substantive rationality of capitalism as a means of satisfying human wants and meeting human needs. When we turn to the profit-making enterprise, the situation is different, but this is definitionally the case since the profit-making enterprise is defined by an orientation not to utilities but to profit, an objective quantitative difference between income and expenditure. In this case, monetary calculation is the appropriate form of rational economic action, not because of the particular rationality of money calculation, but because of the substantive orientation of action to profit. The rationality of monetary calculation in this case is simply an expression of the rationality of the profit-making enterprise, and so again presupposes the substantive rationality of capitalist economic institutions. In neither of these cases can the rationality of the monetary calculation be characterized in terms of a peculiarly rational value orientation of action. The rationality of monetary calculation cannot be reduced to the subjectively rational orientation of action, but can only be established as an expression of the objective rationality of the market and of the profit-making enterprise as means for the provision of human needs. Monetary calculation can only be subjectively rational to the extent that monetary calculation provides an objectively more rational means of achieving given economic ends. The coherence of Weber's sociology rests on the validity of the economist's demonstration of the objective economic rationality of the capitalist economic system, a demonstration whose validity Weber took for granted, but one which accords neither with reason nor with experience. Weber only avoids the inevitable conclusion by adopting the economist's designation of this objective rationality as purely, quote, not quote, italicized, purely formal, with no substantive implications and so with no evaluative significance. However, as I have argued at length above, this designation rests on the illegitimate abstraction of the economic institutions of capitalist society from the social relations within which they are necessarily inscribed, on the abstraction of exchange relations from the social relations of production and distribution, on the abstraction of the life of the commodity from the life of the commodity owner, on the abstraction of the state of perfect equilibrium from the conditions of ignorance and uncertainty in which economic decisions are made, on the abstraction of economic relations from consideration of the social power inherent in such relations. In short, the abstraction of an ideal world of the, quote, economy from the reality of, quote, society, and in this sense on the, quote, naturalization of economic relationships. It is only on this basis, which forcibly abstracts consideration of formal economic relationships from consideration of their substantive material and social implications, that the rationality of the capitalist economy can be designated as a purely, quote, formal rationality. Correspondingly, the distinction between the, quote, formal rationality of capitalism and capitalism's, quote, substantive irrationality does not express a dilemma inherent in capitalism between its supposed economic efficiency and capitalism's undoubted social injustice, but a dilemma constructed by the liberal social theorist between her ideal justification of capitalist society and everyday reality. Weber's sociology, like marginalist economics, rested on the abstraction of the social actor from the social relations within which she was inserted, in taking the ends and value orientations of action as the given starting point of sociology. We saw in the last chapter that the marginalist characterization of the abstract individual presupposed the social relations of production within which the individual was inserted, which appeared in a fetishized form in the needs and resources attributed to the individual economic actor. In the same way, we have now seen that Weber's characterization of both the ends and the value orientations of action presupposes the social relations within which the individual is inserted and to which action is oriented, a presupposition which is concealed by Weber's implicit reference to the, quote, naturalization of social relations of marginalist economics, so that the mutable social constraints, which define the limits of the subjective rationality of, quote, formally rational economic action, are fetishized as immutable natural and technological constraints, and the contradictions of capitalism appear as the unavoidable fate of humanity. The immediate implication is that the rationalization of European society, of which the development of capitalism is for Weber only one aspect, cannot be seen as a generalized change in the value orientation of action in the direction of purely formal rationality, even if, as in Weber's sociology, this rationality is not given an absolute value. The, quote, rationality of capitalism is not merely historically specific. The rationality of capitalism is bound by the social forms of production and reproduction characteristic of a particular form of society, outside of which such a value orientation would be profoundly irrational. If it is to be seen as a rational process, it can only be seen as the process through which the particularistic and traditionalistic barriers to the development of the social relations of capitalist production are swept away. Weber's attempt to conceptualize the coherence of capitalist society, to explain how law, the state, and religious belief just happen to take on forms appropriate to rational economic action, leads back to the economic reductionism that Weber sought to avoid. As I have already noted in relation to the rationality, quote, rationality, of political, legal, and religious action, where Weber simply took the existence of a state, a church, and an intellectual and cultural environment as historically given, Weber only avoids confronting the dilemma with which he had presented sociology by falling back on an historicist empiricism at this critical point. Weber recognized that the, quote, formal rationality of capitalism was compromised by capitalism's, quote, substantive irrationality.
He recognized that the institutional domination of this form of rationality corresponded to the interests of a particular class. Weber recognized that the peculiar rationality of, quote, formally rational forms of legal and political domination lay in their relationship to the capitalist economy. Weber recognized that the historical birth of capitalism was marked not so much by the advance of reason as by pervasive class violence. All these considerations would appear to undermine his typology of ends and value orientations, which attributes primacy to the principles of, quote, formal rationality over its particular expressions, and which purports to establish the autonomy of distinctive value spheres. However, Weber does not draw this conclusion because Weber's methodological insistence that his, quote, ideal types are purely hypothetical constructs which do not make any knowledge claims render these ideal types immune from rational criticism. For Weber, sociological understanding had to take actually existing society as its given starting point, and can only achieve an interpretive understanding of action within that given framework. Thus, Weber severely limited the explanatory power of sociology and of economics in making sociology into a discipline that merely elaborated a typology that could provide the basis for the only valid form of knowledge, that of the historical interpretation of meaningful action. Sociology cannot explain either the ends that actors set for themselves, the values that orient those ends, or the social relations within which action takes place. All that it can do is to elaborate the hypothetical consequences of action on the basis of those ends. Values and social relations, achieving an interpretive account of the subjective aspect of the reproduction and transformation of economic, social, and cultural relations. Weber's empiricism, which confines sociology to the interpretive understanding of the superficial forms of appearance of social relations, explains the strong streak of irrationalism running through Weber's sociology. For the ultimate foundations of social action are not amenable to rational explanation. The subjective orientation of action is ultimately arbitrary, and the choice of particular ends and value orientations irrational. Whereas for Menger, organic social institutions developed through the collective emulation of individual initiatives based on a recognition of the rationality of the innovation. For Weber, rationality was itself not an ultimate value, and so could not provide the ultimate basis of sociological explanation. The development of the economy and society was not the development of a universal reason, for capitalism was rational only from one point of view, that of formal rationality. This irrationalism explains the pivotal role of the concept of charisma in Weber's sociology. The ultimate basis of social change is changes in the system of values underlying social action. The need for such changes arises to the extent that existing values do not provide a completely coherent image of the world as a meaningful whole. However, changes in values cannot be explained in terms of the subjective rational evaluation of alternative sets of values, on the basis, for example, of class interests, since interests are not defined independently of the view of the world in which they are embedded.
Thus, while there may be a, quote, elective affinity between the values ultimately adopted and the interest of those adopting them, there are no rational grounds for adopting or modifying a particular set of values in the first place. The conclusion is that the adoption of new values can only be explained in terms of their irrational appeal. It is this irrational appeal, often attached to the personality of the proponents of the new values, which is captured in Weber's concept of charisma. New values are constantly emerging, but the generalization of normative innovations cannot be a process of rational emulation, but only of the irrational substitution of one set of beliefs for another. Thus, new values only become a significant social force when they are proposed by a personality who attracts a following on the basis of her charismatic appeal. When this following acquires a critical mass, it is given an institutional form. It is through this, quote, routinization of charisma, end quote, that the new values acquire an institutional permanence and authority which facilitates the generalization of their appeal. Capitalist rationality and the dilemmas of modernity. For Weber, the rationality of capitalism consists in the increasing subordination of economic activity to the single-minded pursuit of economic ends. But this development is profoundly irrational from other than a narrowly materialistic point of view. The substantive irrationality of capitalism is not simply a matter of Weber's own personal judgment, but of the values embedded in other spheres of social life, and in particular in politics and religion. Weber's diagnosis of the substantive irrationality of modern society is complex and notoriously ambiguous. In this section, I can do no more than outline what appear to be its fundamental principles before indicating the problem which it defines for sociology. Weber recognized that the substantive irrationality of capitalism is the necessary and inevitable accompaniment to the generalization of the, quote, formal rationality that characterizes the capitalist economy. However, for Weber, such irrationality is not the result of capitalism, but of the wider process of rationalization. As the defining feature of modernity, of which capitalist economic rationality is only one aspect, this rationalization, following the logic of the division of labor, involves the radical separation of different spheres of social life, according to the typical ends pursued and the rational adaptation of means to ends in each of those spheres. Thus, the economic, political, and religious spheres, as well as art, music, literature, science, the erotic, etc., each acquire a relative autonomy from one another as the condition for the single-minded pursuit of their characteristic ends. Within each of these spheres taken separately, means are rationally adapted to ends. This fragmentation of social life comes into conflict with the essential unity of society, both objectively and subjectively. Objectively, as we have seen, economic action has political and religious implications, so that the single-minded pursuit of economic ends comes into conflict with the pursuit of political and religious ends, while the dominance of economic and bureaucratic rationality is a barrier to the attempt to achieve substantive ethical ends, particularly on the part of the poor and the powerless. Subjectively, the fragmentation of experience leads to a fundamental incoherence at the heart of the modern personality, which comes into conflict with the need to develop a coherent view of the world. The substantive irrationality of modern society
has its foundations in this fragmentation and incoherence of the system of values. The original impetus towards the rationalization of modern society lay in the emergence of a coherently rationalist worldview. However, the rationalization of society soon acquires its own momentum. The fragmentation of modern society and the rationalization of its separate spheres constitutes an iron cage, quote, iron cage, which imposes a formally rational orientation to action on its participants in each relatively autonomous sphere. Thus, market competition imposes rational behavior on every participant in economic life. The capitalist can only remain a capitalist if he subordinates his activity to the goal of profit maximization. If the capitalist runs his firm on the basis of principles of brotherly love, he will soon go bust. Similarly, the worker has to subordinate herself to the work ethic and rationally calculate her household budget in order to make the most of her scarce resources. The bureaucrat is similarly constrained by bureaucratic rules and procedures to conduct her business in accordance with the canons of bureaucratic rationality, and those subject to the rules have to calculate their consequences. Within a capitalist society, the anonymous rule of the market and inequalities of wealth tend to secure the dominance of the economic sphere, so that value conflicts tend to be resolved in favor of economic rationality. Political and hierarchic organizations, writers, artists, and intellectuals have to have as much regard to their economic viability as does the capitalist enterprise, while the power and patronage of the rich helps them to secure the dominance of their interest in all social spheres. However, socialism, far from resolving the contradiction between the formal rationality and the substantive irrationality of modern society, threatens to develop this contradiction to its ultimate limits in supplanting the dominance of economic rationality by the dominance of bureaucratic rationality, sacrificing the economic rationality and relative political freedom of capitalism for the ultimate nightmare of a totalitarian bureaucratic tyranny. 1 second. Okay. The contradiction between the formal rationality and the substantive irrationality of modern society cannot be overcome through the dominance of one form of rationality, embedded in one sphere of social life over all others, but only by developing some means of resolving value conflicts on the basis of a coherent system of overarching values. The dilemma is that for Weber, the fragmentation of social life makes it increasingly difficult to sustain any coherent view of the social world as a whole, let alone to reshape the world in accordance with such a view, and equally makes it very difficult to develop a shared view of the world which can unite significant social groupings. Weber tended to follow the logic of his argument to take a pessimistic view of humanity's tragic fate, leaving the individual to scrabble in the ruins to construct a personal meaning as best she may. The only possibility of salvation lay in the emergence of a charismatic figure who could provide moral and political leadership on the basis of a coherent worldview. The ultimate tragedy is that this diagnosis led Weber to promote the inclusion of the clause in the Weimar Constitution, which permitted Hitler to come to power as just such a figure a decade after Weber's death. That's interesting. Weber offered an acute and extremely influential diagnosis of the contradictions of modernity, the only such diagnosis which stands comparison with that of Marx in recognizing that the, quote, substantive irrationality of modern society is not simply a pathological deformation of a rational normality, but is inherent in the process of, quote, rationalization. Weber recognized that the contradiction between the, quote, formal rationality of modern society and modern society's, quote, substantive irrationality is not simply a matter of an arbitrary subjective evaluation, but is an objective feature of modern society, expressed in the conflict between systems of values and within the individual personality, which has objective historical consequences. But unlike Marx, Weber could not get to the roots of this contradiction in the alienated forms of social labor, because he saw such forms of labor as rational. Thus he remained trapped within a dualistic theory of capitalist society, in which the individual subject confronts an objective social world which is indifferent to meaning and impervious to action, whose objectivity is defined functionally, in relation to ends which have become detached from their individual foundations and embedded in the social structure. Weber's diagnosis of the contradictions of modernity is a mystification of the fundamental contradictions of the capitalist mode of production. But Weber's diagnosis of the contradictions of modernity remains a very powerful diagnosis because it is a very acute expression of the forms in which those contradictions appear to experience. Weber's misanthropic and pessimistic fatalism reflected the circumstances of time and place and of the cultural and intellectual milieu in which he wrote, so that his own solution was hardly supportive of the liberal project. Nevertheless, he defined the dilemmas confronting liberalism in the wake of the marginalist revolution in economics, dilemmas which any rigorous liberal sociology would have to resolve. The central problem was a simple one: how to define sociology as a discipline which is both critical of marginalist economics in establishing the socio-historical limits of economic rationality, while at the same time recognizing the limits to sociology embodied in the liberal principles of individual rationality expressed in the economic theories of marginalism. This theoretical problem expressed the fundamental dilemma of modern liberalism. Is it possible to formulate a critique of the inhumanity of modern capitalism on the basis of precisely those liberal principles of which modern capitalism is the expression and the result? It is because Weber was acutely aware that there were no simple solutions to this simple problem that he could define the dilemmas confronting sociology so acutely.